Okay, hello. Thanks very much for coming. Having been to two conventions in Poland before, two conferences, I expected this talk to be in a room with about 6 people over a couple of beers. So if you can try and recreate that feeling, please do feel free to ask any questions at any point. And there we go. I should also point out that this is, basically, I've written a trilogy about Vikings and Indians, and while researching it, I found out some really cool stuff that I want to tell you about. I am not a professor of history. I'm not even a doctor of history. I haven't even studied history since I was about 14. So please don't expect anything too technical. And if you ask questions, they should be of a more general nature, about life and things like that, which I can talk about more easily. Excuse me just for a moment. So, 1,000 years ago, Vikings traveled to North America. Where did they go and what did they find there? In Angus Watson's second trilogy, West of West, a group of Vikings crossed North America 1,000 years ago. Researching the books, I found out some amazing things, la la la. So there we go. If you're not here for this, it's best to go now, I think. So the first question, are we sure the Vikings got to America? When people my age were taught history in America and the UK, and I dare say Poland as well, you were taught that Columbus discovered America when he sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Of course, the whole concept of discovery is very messed up, considering there are already several million people living there. It's like saying I discovered Poland because I got here, and then saying, and that's mine. But if we just accept that word for now, the Vikings were definitely there before Columbus. Until around 1965, this was based on 2 sagas, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, which together are called the Vinland sagas. And in these sagas, a voyage to North America is discovered. It's fairly obvious. You go to Iceland first, then Greenland, next stop North America. The distances are about the same. It's against the prevailing wind, but for seafarers, it's not a particularly difficult journey. But it wasn't believed because Columbus discovered America, and everybody knew that. Then, in around 1965, they found a village in Newfoundland, which is now called L'Anse-aux-Meadows, which is a Viking village. It absolutely is. There's no denying it at all. Runestones were found, unequivocal evidence that Vikings were in North America. And judging by how big the village is, around 500 Vikings were in North America. Now, because history is what it is, historians say now around 500 Vikings got to America. They all lived in this one place. I mean, that's clearly not true. The Vikings were the bravest people that ever lived. Sorry, that's a bit of an exaggeration. They were jolly brave, though, because they had this whole philosophy, you die when you die. So you couldn't be killed, basically, because you're always going to die at the same place. So I could throw myself head first off the stage and I'd be fine. Or I'd die, but that was because today would be my day of my death. So they're very brave people. Around, I think, I've got this figure somewhere, but there were about 5,000 Vikings living in Greenland in the 13th century. The chances were quite a lot of them went across the water into America. Also, by the 15th century, all these Vikings had left Greenland, and we don't know where they went. And so historians just say, meh, probably not America. But the fact was America was quite easy to get to, and the Vikings were adventurous. So yeah, the big point is that history knows very little about the past. And I think it's a very important thing to remember when you're dealing with history. It really is only the bits we know. And yeah, to say the Viking only 500 is ridiculous. So anyway, the other point is people don't leave things behind generally. So there are there's no evidence, for example, of Caesar's invasions of Britain. Caesar came to Britain twice, once with 12,000 soldiers, once with 25,000 soldiers. The only evidence for this is his diaries. If we didn't have his diaries, we wouldn't know that it had happened. There's not a spear point, there's no Roman stuff left at all, because people who come afterwards use things. So the fact that there's no evidence of Vikings in America just does not mean they didn't get further. So they probably did. Okay, the other point is, we've got 2 sagas which say they go there. The sagas were written several hundred years later, and they don't really cover much at all. So we don't know what they did. Now, I am going to look into what they found when they got to North America, because North America, 1,000 years ago, was strangely enough a very different place to what the Europeans found not that long afterwards, and it changed very quickly before anybody made notes, as soon as Europeans did start invading America in a big way. Now, you know about feathers and peace pipes. you know that most Native Americans were left-handed. You know that they used every single part of a buffalo. You probably know that the Blackfeet tribe had 88 uses for the buffalo. And you probably also know that the correct word is bison, not buffalo. You know they had canoes, and you know they were good at shooting arrows from horseback. But I'm going to tell you stuff you don't know, I hope, and focus on two amazing places in America. So, our image of Native Americans comes mostly from the 19th century, when Europeans were encountering them in the West and drawing them and writing about them. First important thing to mention, they didn't have horses. The idea of Indians riding horses is wrong because there were no horses in North America. They died out 12,000 years ago and they were reintroduced by the Europeans. They were not Stone Age. One important thing which I should have put higher up in this lecture, and I haven't, is that they were very varied. I mean, North America was a continent, and the people existing in the southwest, in the desert, in the Great Basin Desert down there, were very different to the people in the northwest around the Great Lakes, for example. And the people in the northwest around Great Lakes were using metal. They weren't smelting metal, they were annealing metal. In other words, they were finding lumps of metal in the soil, and meteoric iron and that sort of thing, and hammering it, heating it and hammering it into shape. So they did have metal tools and jewelry and things like that. Which brings me on to the next point. They didn't have the wheel. You might know this already, but the Americans didn't discover the wheel, which must have been a real moment when they saw one, because they'd been moving a lot of stuff around, usually on logs, if it was particularly heavy, or on a little thing behind dogs called a travois, or travois. I've only ever read the word, to be honest. I don't know how you say it. So yes, I mean, in Southwest America, they had looms to weave clothes, which didn't exist in the other areas of America where they used different types. Their hairstyles were very varied, just like us. They plucked the hair with tweezers. They used bare fat for wax. But strange enough, leisure and sport was quite uniform across the continent. They loved a sauna, for example. Sweat houses are common across North America. I feel like I'm in one at the moment, standing talking to all of you, but I've got to try and get past that. And they had arch spear throwing. They had lacrosse, of course. That's a Native American sport. And various other things. They were quite into their drugs. But alcohol only really existed in southwestern America, in the desert there, where it came up from South America itself. It leaked over from the Aztecs, who had over 40 types of booze, which they enjoyed, including cactus wine. And they used peyote, which you've probably heard of as a drug to make you work harder and dance harder. Bigger doses were taken, and the idea is that it was for religious ceremonies. We're not really sure about that, whether it was taken just for leisure or mucking about too. And they also had a drug called black drink, which was a drink that made you vomit. And the Cahokians, who we're going to get onto in a minute, drank so much that they would be sick blood. So they took it quite far. It's interesting that historians always like to ascribe a religious aspect to everything they come across, like the drug taking for Native Americans. There is some evidence that it was religious, but also, you know, was it for sport? Was it just for entertainment, for dancing, like modern usage of drugs? I think that's more likely than we admit. So we do have the idea that they were busy foraging and hunting the whole time and eking a meager existence out of a bleak environment. That is true in the deserts of the West. It was, you know, hard life and everything was used. But there were places where life, you know, where farming was abundant and life was easy, relatively. There's wild rice grows in North America, and in a lot of places this meant that people didn't have to farm. They had a rich source of food that they could use and sell, and had much more leisure time on their hands. There are various different ways to use this. You could stamp it and pound it and separate it into a bread and use it with maple syrup in a delicious stew, apparently. The idea also that Native Americans used every single part of a bison or buffalo, I prefer the word buffalo, isn't entirely accurate. They quite often used what are called hunting kettles, where you could drive a whole herd of bison over a cliff and you'd kill them all, and they would only take the meat from the female buffalo of the right age and just leave the rest to rot in the sun. We tend to have quite a romantic view of Native Americans, and I think it's nice that we do, but it's not entirely accurate. Because there were definitely some gruesome things going on. The Iraqi Indian, for example, this is post-contact, but they had a war with the Huron, and they captured 2 French missionaries. And I won't go into detail. They tortured them to death really, really horribly. And they'd obviously been doing this for a while. They were very good at it. And so that was common. And there is, of course, the famous Crow Creek massacre, where 500 bodies have been found, all horribly massacred. So they weren't all peace-loving, sensible, old, craggy people. They were as varied as Europe. Okay, so the one place I'm going to talk about, in my book, I don't think I'll spoil too much by saying the Vikings, at the very beginning, have got as far as what is Chicago now. And south of them, in the real world, was a city called Cahokia, where 1,000 years ago, the population was around 15,000, so it was bigger at the time than London. And nobody knows about this, and I have pictures of it because I thought it was going to be about like 6 of us, but it's not going to work on this. But it was a huge planned city with a great big pyramid in the middle, a huge sporting ground in front of it, and other pyramids around. The idea being that the pyramid was home of the rulers, and there is other people. And it shows, and there must have been a great supporting culture, and nobody knows about this because, I'll tell you a little more about the place. It was the wall around just the sporting area in the big pyramid was around 2 miles long, was rebuilt every few years. It's about 14 foot high. There's an idea that just building the wall itself contributed to the decline of the population, but it's slightly a sort of a modern idea that they couldn't manage to do that because clearly there was a whole ecosystem and a whole system of government and society supporting this huge city, which we just don't know about because in around, well, I think it's around 1350 in our years, it was deserted. And we don't know why. We have no idea. And so our image that the Indians were just tiny tribes, it was completely wrong. This vast city. Yeah, it was 1350. And we know very little about what was going on there, apart from, I've got quite a few details here. There's a lot of signs of women being ritually sacrificed and other grim stuff going on. I think I'll leave it. The other place I want to talk about, where I traveled to in North America, is a place called Mesa Verde. On the other side of America, in what is now Colorado, there's a town called Mesa Verde. Well, it's a whole area. And in this area are huge towns built into the cliffs, like a sort of Machu Picchu. And I'm amazed that fewer people don't know about this. Again, they were big fans of torture. There were various massacres there, and there were other settlements nearby. A settlement in Chaco Canyon had a huge stone-built settlement called Pueblo Bonito. Well, it's called Pueblo Bonito now, it wasn't then. Of 800 rooms, about 200 of which were just filled with rubbish, but maybe there were 1,500 people living there. This is in the deserts. This would have been very difficult to support. They supported it with irrigation channels and agriculture, not just going out and looking for lizards, as is generally thought. Well, as I said, basically, I was just going through cool stuff that I discovered when I was doing my research. That wasn't a very well-formed lecture. I'd like to take any questions that you'd like to ask. Hello. No, there's absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. But it's an interesting point. Around 95% of Native Americans were wiped out after 1492. And yeah, the Vikings may well have had a similar effect. And perhaps that led to the huge population decline in 1350. But it seems an unlikely point. What's interesting is there isn't much about, it wasn't just the disease, it was massacre as well that led to the massive decline in Indians, and there's not much writing about that for obvious reasons. Can I take any other questions? Yes? Yeah, the person over there is asking about rumors in South America of white-skinned people coming from across the sea. This brings me on to a great point I should have mentioned, and the fact that history doesn't know everything. We know now historically that the Vikings were the first people to reach North America, but we don't know even slightly that they were the first people to reach North America. For example, traces of cocaine have been found in Egyptian mummies from 2000 BC. And cocaine is only found in South America. So again, it's a big I reckon, but I think people got there before the Vikings. Why didn't they? Very little, as I said, very little has been written down. We know very little about what happened. It's likely that Asians got to North America. It's likely that the people who crossed and populated the South Sea Islands, Vanuatu, and further into what's now the Marshall Islands, it's very likely they went further and arrived in America. So yes, it's very likely the Vikings weren't in fact the first Europeans or Asians to discover America. It's likely it was discovered, found beforehand. And of course, the Native Americans themselves came across, the idea is they came across the Siberian land bridge 15,000 years ago. So they themselves were the first Europeans to find America, as it were. Thanks. That was what was the thing that pushed me into researching the whole thing. The main point was I love the North American landscape. I love the desert. I went to the desert for the first time about 7 years ago, and I just love the landscape so much, the way it's stripped bare. So you can see these huge rock formations. If you go to somewhere like Death Valley in California, or Arches National Park, or Canyonlands in Utah, it just makes hair stand up on the back of my neck just thinking about it. It's such a beautiful scenery. And not only that, because the landscape's stripped so bare, you can see the animals really easily. So it's quite normal to see a chuckwalla, or a big lizard, or a coyote, or an owl. So that was my first interest. But spending a lot of time walking around there on my own, because I take photographs too a bit. And so I went there first just for photography. And I really started, I got terrified when I went miles off-road on my own, sort of drive 7 miles up a stream bed in Death Valley and then walk 4 miles and then suddenly just freak out because it's so scary. And, you know, every story about things going wrong starts with a lone hiker. And I'd always think, but the point being, it hit me emotionally, and I thought, what was it like to live here? When it was like this, that's the other point. When you walk into the wilderness in America, it's great because you can leave the car and within 5 minutes be somewhere no one's been for a few weeks, and it's exactly as it was, you know, 1,000 years ago. So that was what inspired me. It was the landscape itself, and wondering what had happened there before. Yep. Yeah, that question is, why don't people know that people were there before Columbus? Because it gives us an entire perspective. The point is, we don't know that there were. We don't know for certain, and history works on certainties. And that's it, really. And you know, it fits the narrative. Well, I mean, the whole idea of the white man finding America is pretty horrible. because basically we took the land of the people who were there, and it was largely a lot of British people did it, and we also did it in Australia. But it suits the narrative to say that this was an empty land that had been found by no one before, or it was called a terra nullis, a land of no one. Ooh, hello. Was any Viking culture discovered in Indian culture? No. The Indians, the Native Americans, are very sort of cagey about their cultures. They don't share them very much with the white invader to a large degree. So and also their oral histories, and a lot of them were killed. So it's very possible that anything that did happen was squashed. There have been various Viking findings. There was, for example, a rune stone that was found in Minnesota that said something like 15 Norsemen strong and true came to this land. They've all been proved to be fakes so far. Now, if you want to get really skeptical, you can say, well, maybe they weren't fakes, and maybe history, yeah, but I think they were probably fakes. Sorry? Candy stone? Oh, Kensington stones, that's what they're called, exactly, right, you're right, the Kensington stone. Green-haired chap person over there. Okay, that's, yeah, you've heard that Native Americans had stories about bearded men coming, arriving, and is that Vikings because, oh, they called Europeans bearded people, and is that to do with the Vikings coming? I think no on two levels, one because Europeans had beards, I look around, and if you are on a ship on your way across to America, shaving isn't going to be a premium. And also, Native Americans have facial hair. They pluck and they shave. I mean, maybe not as much, but it's not unusual. A Native American can grow a beard. Ooh, bearded person. The only thing we know is that they fought. And we don't know that. That's what the sagas tell us, which were written 150 years and 200 years after the event. So Vikings called the Native Americans Skraelings. And according to them, the Skraelings attacked them with arrows and basically drove them out of the land. So that was, after, I can't remember the exact details, to be honest. It was a while back. I read that saga. There was various interactions and misunderstandings that led to fighting. I haven't watched the show. I haven't watched it for one big reason. I didn't want to be influenced by it. I heard it was very good, and I mean to watch it, is the first reason. And the second is my wife pretty much decides what we watch on TV in the evening. I don't that one over there. Did they? I didn't hear you. Breed cattle. Did they breed cattle? No. No, they hunted buffalo, which are correctly termed bison. But they didn't, as far as I know, have any domestic breeds of cattle. How they managed to hunt bison? How they managed the big cities? Agriculture. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if they were. Sorry? Were they in Las Vegas? Vegans, were they vegans? No, I don't think so, because they ate a lot of bison, and that's quite meaty. But I mean, and of course, Cahokia is right next to Mississippi as well, so they would have supported it by a lot of fishing too. The sagas were stories that returned from North America. The sagas were written a long time after the events. They're part of the Icelandic sagas, and most of them were written for political reasons. It's now theorized or accepted. So, for example, the second saga, which I think is the saga of Eric the Red, has a guy called Leif Erikson discovering America. Now, there was a bishop at the time who was trying to get into power, and he was a direct descendant of Leif Erikson, so that is theoretically why Leif was picked up in the sagas. So the answer is they were written a long time after the events. They're unlikely to have much truth in them, which is why it was discounted, why people didn't believe the Americans had been to, the Vikings had been to America.
So presumably, many more people knew about these travels and journeys into North America. Why didn't more Vikings follow?
Why didn't more Vikings follow? Maybe they did. That's my point, and that's what my book's about, basically. We know there were 5,000 Vikings in Greenland. Or it's theorized by what's known now. That if and they went somewhere after, they were driven out of it, Greenland, that people we now call the Eskimos. They were called a Thule back in the day. And people didn't know because simply people didn't write things down. We don't know an awful lot of history. A lot of empires have come and gone that we know nothing about. And that's the point, rather, that, and especially they didn't come back. And they were somehow, maybe they were killed, maybe they're assumed into Native American tribes. Actually, the person in white behind you.
So you say that there is a possibility that many cultures from the old world visited the new world at a long time, but actually there is, it would be probably quite most of those cultures, the people of this culture, they would interbreed with one another, but yet there is no evidence in the DNA of almost all the Native American groups that they descend from anyone than those Siberian nomads that came from Siberia.
So there's no DNA evidence now that Native Americans have any other blood but Native Americans.
Yeah, for example, they don't have no Hebrew. There is in Native Americans there is no B blood group.
There's no B blood group, and that would have come from European settlers.
And 0 is the most, the A is the most ancestral group, and B is A is a little bit later, and the group B both around the Middle East about quite later than the Arabians, Siberians.
Okay, well, there are three possible answers to that. One, 95% of people killed after occupation, so it's possible that the knots of population which were influenced by European settlers were wiped out. Two, that they haven't sampled enough DNA, that there are still some Native Americans with that DNA. And three, that the Europeans didn't, in fact, get there at all. And it's just speculation. And it is just speculation, but it's not disproved by the DNA.
So do we have any reason to believe those sagas that were written many years later after those travels, that they were based on any real information, right? Or culture or anything like that, or do we don't know anything?
No, it's entirely up to you whether you believe the sagas or not. But the fact that the Viking village was found proves that the Vikings were there. Yeah, maybe that village was founded by people by a completely separate mission to the ones written about in the sagas. Maybe the ones written about in the sagas didn't happen, but they did know that there was a land to the west of Greenland. How did it affect the Vikings' mentality as a nation? They could reach something that other people didn't. Well, I don't know if they had a particular mentality as a nation. There's groups of villages that sent out raids to various places, and they didn't, I think, have a sense of them. They didn't have a football team. They didn't have a sense of themselves as a collective. We need to give them labels now. That's why they're called the Vikings. That's a term that came afterwards, because they went Viking And also, I think that you know, there would have been stories about people traveling far. So yes, but perhaps it may have inspired other people to adventure. But I think, as a general national consensus, it would have depended very much on where you live. So if you had a hero who traveled, then yes, it would have inspired more people to travel. But I think, as a whole, they didn't consider themselves as a whole. Anything else to ask? Oh, sorry. Yes, hello. Sorry, I'm getting on a bit. I can't. Ah.
By Scandinavian sagas, all the Viking stories about lands west, and is there some confirmation in some writings like diaries or memoirs?
Was Columbus inspired by writings to go and find lands in the west? In other words, had you seen the Vinland sagas?
More like sagas or mentions.
Would he have been inspired by the Viking sagas to go west? I don't know. Does anyone know the answer to that question? I don't know why Columbus. Of course, I do know. Yeah, there we go. I'm surprised myself. Columbus wasn't looking for America. Columbus was looking for India, which is why we call the Indians Indians. Well, they'd known the world was round for a while, but the world is round, so you had to be able to get to India the other way. So that's where he was going when he found America. He thought he'd landed in India. Hmm? Yeah, he was lucky America was there. He would have died otherwise, just like us in World War II. I think we're going to wrap it up. I think I'm going to let you out early, unless someone's got anything else to ask. Hey, well, thanks very much for coming. You've been great. Yeah, no.